Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and to everyone who is on the line today, thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about managing high-stakes team meetings, how to lead, and how to contribute. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to check out the link that's in the chat box, because there is a one-page handout that I encourage you to print and take notes on today as we work through today's webinar. And I want to reiterate what Bridget had said. Please, at any time, feel free to send a question and let Bridget know that you want to chime in, because I want this to be more of a conversation than a speech or a presentation. And that's a concept I'm actually going to talk about as we move through today's talk. So let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the work that we do at Turpin Communication, so you have some context for why I'm the lucky guy who gets to talk with all of you today. So Turpin Communication is a presentation and facilitation skills training company. And as you can see on the slide in front of us, our tagline is Business Communication Untangled. And if you think about it, so many of us get tangled up in our minds about how are we going to have a particular conversation, or maybe you experience nervousness when you even think about presenting, and maybe you have a hard time managing meetings once they take on a life of their own. The work that we do is to help people get untangled so that they can be as efficient and effective as possible. And as Bridget said, we've been working with FFI now for doing the math about 12 years, working primarily with the faculty members of the GEN program in its many iterations over the years as it has evolved. So that's a little bit about me. My goal for you today is to help you move business forward effectively and efficiently when we're in meetings, because the last thing we want to do is to cause confusion. So our vision at Turpin Communication is this. We envision a future where meetings, presentations, and training sessions are the least frustrating parts of doing business. The least frustrating part of doing business is really important, because if we take a look at this image right here on the screen, this is what we want to avoid, especially when we are working with clients. We don't want people to feel that their time is being wasted or that the meeting is going nowhere. So that's the spirit of today's conversation. I'm going to be speaking about the best practices that we've accumulated over the years, and I will invite you to think about the way these concepts apply to the unique work that you do as consultants to family businesses. So our agenda looks like this. We're going to talk about two primary things, some guiding principles of the work. So we're going to lay some foundation for effective communication. And then we're going to move into the meat of today's session, which is the ground rules for effective meetings. And that's that handout that I asked you to print. And then, time permitting, we will look at some bonus material, and you all will get to choose what path we go down, because I have several options that I could talk about, but I'd rather allow you to decide what we want to talk about. So that's what we'll do here for the next 50 minutes or so. So let's jump into the guiding principles. The first one here is that we believe that presentations, meetings, and training sessions are what we call orderly conversations. And as you can see, there's a picture of the book that I co-authored with Turpin Communication's founder back in 2014. So let me help you understand what an orderly conversation is. So here we have what we would call a communication continuum. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have just a very informal conversation, and then working our way over to the right, we have formal speeches. So if you think about the conferences that you attend with FFI, the general sessions, the keynotes, generally are over on the right-hand side in the speech bucket. When you go out to lunch with a friend, or even maybe having a one-on-one with someone in your office, that's more of a conversation. An orderly conversation, though, is really these two areas in the middle, the meeting and presentation. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And so let's go a little bit deeper into how we would define an orderly conversation. So here we have a graphic. On one side we have orderly, the other side we have conversation. So on the orderly side, we've got preparation, accuracy, and structure. So if you think of the presentation slide deck that I'm using right now, it is orderly. It required that I do some preparation. Hopefully it's accurate, and there's a certain structure that I've put together. And all of that work took place in the past, maybe an hour ago, last night, a week ago, a year ago, doesn't matter, but it took place in the past. But what we're having right now needs to feel like a conversation, which means it requires engagement, spontaneity, and interactivity. Now, this is a little less interactive, a little less spontaneous because we're in the virtual environment right now. But you can imagine that if we were in a breakout session or just a meeting having this conversation, it could take on a life of its own. So what that means then with this new slide is that when you are planning for a communication event, you're always looking ahead to the uncertainties of the conversation. Now, the uncertainties could be a technology breakdown. That's an easy one to get your head around. It could also be the uncertainties of what other people are going to say in the meeting, because you don't have any control over that. And sometimes what people have to say can turn emotional or even hostile, and you have to be able to deal with that. Now, another uncertainty, though, is your own uncertainty. So if we take me as an example, I tend to be very forgetful when I'm in front of a group of people. I get kind of excited and the juices start flowing in my brain, and I can't necessarily trust myself to remember all of the nuance that I wanted to talk about. So what that means for me then is I need to load my slides or my handwritten notes. I need to load that up with maybe more thought triggers than what somebody else would have to, because one of the uncertainties is my own forgetfulness. Now, that also means, though, that once the conversation starts, we're always adapting what was planned to what's happening in the moment, because you can't just go into a meeting with a singular plan and ignore the fact that other people are going to be contributing to it. So you can see that this sense of the orderly conversation is rather cyclical. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction in my slide deck. There we go. Now I've got the second guiding principle of our work, which is find your focus, be yourself, only better. Now, I mentioned earlier that our tagline is business communication untangled. That's our new tagline. This is our old tagline, find your focus, be yourself, only better. So let me explain what this means. We'll start in the middle with be yourself. We believe at Turpin Communication that in order to have an honest conversation and be perceived as the genuine person that you are, you have to be yourself. There's no putting on a mask to be like somebody else, not to be like a manager you had in the past. Or a lot of times we hear people say, well, I want to be like Anderson Cooper, or I want to be like Oprah Winfrey. And while they may be effective communicators, that's not who you are. So you have to really start with, your genuine self. Backing up on the left-hand side of the screen is that you have to understand what it is that gets you focused. So if you tend to be scatterbrained or long-winded or nervous when it comes to speaking in public, you need to understand what are the behaviors and what are the skills that you can latch onto that you use in everyday conversation to help you be focused so that you can be yourself. And then the only better part is the most buttoned down, ready to go professional version. So that's our second guiding principle. Our third guiding principle is that business communicators succeed on two levels. So put yourself in a meeting where you are leading it. You have the first level of success, which is achieving the plan. And then the second level of success is managing the process to get to the plan. So let me unpack this just a little bit. The first level of the plan is all about achieving the goal. It's getting people to buy, agree, align, or learn whatever it is you're there to do. Oftentimes, though, that doesn't happen as effectively or as efficiently as it should because of mismanagement of the conversation itself. So what does that mean? Well, you need to create the conditions for a fruitful discussion to take place. You need to work to earn their trust and earn their goodwill. You have to make it easy for people to participate, help manage the give and take, and then nurture the relationships. And if you think about it, because you're all consultants, I'm a consultant, and we succeed when we grow and nurture relationships. And one of the ways we do that, one of the primary ways we do that, is by running effective meetings that people actually want to participate in. So those are our three guiding principles. Now I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of work for me and think about your brand in the eyes of your clients. What words would you want them to use to describe you. Now, I'll invite you to put that in chat. The way you would do that is roll your mouse up to the top of the screen, and then there are, to the right-hand side, those dots. You can click that open, and the chat will be one of the options that are there. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to let me know how you would like your clients to describe you. Might find words like professional, partner, strategic thinker, genuine, engaging, heartfelt. Yep, I hear that. Competent, efficient, effective. Great. Thought-provoking, trustworthy. Yeah, a partner. Very good. Professional, trusting, a problem solver, a thought leader. Oh yeah, lots of good stuff here. Easy to work with, an advocate, confident, knowledgeable, expert. Yeah, all of those things we need to exhibit those traits when we're working with our clients. And this is why working to be really solid with our communication is so incredibly important. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because I know all of you are probably really good at your communication already. Okay, thanks so much for sharing all of that with me. I appreciate that. Think about these terms. Think about this brand that you've just identified for yourself as we work through the rest of today's presentation. So, I've just added a little bit to that picture of the flip chart on the right-hand side. It says one way to ensure this happens is to show up in meetings every single time. Okay, let's move on to our second agenda point here, which is why we're in today's conversation, the ground rules for effective meetings. This is where I'm going to ask you to get out the handout that I asked you to print out, take notes on it as we move through. All right, we're going to focus on the very top of this handout right now, the ground rules for effective meetings. And as you can see, there are two groups of people that are identified here. There's the facilitator of the meeting, and there's the attendees of the meeting. And as the bluish box at the bottom says, positive meeting culture requires full participation from both groups. And I think that this is sometimes surprising to people when we talk about it's not just enough to show up as the leader of a meeting, but there are times when you have to show up as the participant of a meeting. And I'd like to tell you a quick story. We'll call it a tale of an expensive high-stakes meeting gone wrong. So this is a client of ours, and she is the head of an international marketing program for a marketing function for a global company. You probably eat their cereal on a daily basis or have some in your cupboard anyway. So anyway, she called, well, her name is Sue, and she called me up and she said, I've got a problem. I am holding incredibly high stakes meetings, full day meetings. And there are about 50 people that I'm inviting to these because we're working on a brand and we are brainstorming and we're presenting ideas. And these meetings are costing me a lot of money. I mean, you can imagine the people that are in a room of that caliber. You've got heads of marketing departments from agencies from all over, not to mention all of the marketing folks in the department itself. And she said, people just aren't participating in the meetings. Sure, they show up and they present their own ideas, but then when somebody else is presenting, they just completely check out. And she says sometimes people are on their phones, other times they're on their devices, other times they're just simply, you know, not paying attention. And she says, I need these people to show up. Can you help me do this? So I said, why don't we do this? Why don't I come in and I'll observe one of these meetings. I'll sit in the back. I won't call any attention to myself because I just want to see this happening live. so that I can address it. And she said, that's great. I've got one of these meetings coming up. How about this? I'll talk for a couple of hours and then you can have the rest of the day. I said, that's great. So those 2 hours while Sue was talking, I saw immediately what she was talking about. Some people were on their devices, some people, I don't know, doing email. I mean, I could see their devices and what they were looking at. And other people just simply weren't paying attention. And so I thought, boy, I got my work cut out for me. So I got up after Sue took a break, and I just said, you know, we've got a problem here. We have your client who is paying a lot of money to have all of these people in this room, and I didn't get the sense that you were engaged with what Sue was talking about. And believe it or not, I saw a lot of nods. And I said, you know, it's important that we all show up. And I said, my expectation for you for the rest of today is that you put your devices down and get out some paper, take notes, because we've got some really important work to do, because we owe it to Sue to do this work. And what was so fascinating to me is in that group of high power people, only 2 people did I see the entire time pick up their device. They were in the meeting and they were ready to go. They were rolling up their sleeves, willing to work with me. And what I discovered in that situation is that these people had never realized that it was their role to show up and be present in the meeting. So that's what I invite you to do today, is always be present when you are in meetings, whether you're leading them or participating in them. Okay, so what that means then is we need to come to the meetings prepared. Preparation is critical. So the facilitator, the left-hand column of the handout, the facilitator needs to think things like this. Before the meeting, I'm going to solidify my plan and I'm going to set expectations and I'm going to select the appropriate attendees. So we have to remember that meetings are expensive. So let's make sure that we don't have the wrong people in the room. Now, as an attendee, that means we need to clear schedules for the allotted time and get ourselves prepared, including the pre-reading. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, now let's talk about the trust that should be present when we are in a meeting, particularly with a client. So as a facilitator, it's your job to create the conditions for a fruitful discussion to take place. That means the conversation needs to be placed within the context of the work you're trying to accomplish, and then actually communicate that. Don't leave that to surprise. As a participant, we need to say things like, you know, I'm going to trust you if you provide context for me and clearly communicate what we're trying to accomplish. So you can see that very clearly both sides have a responsibility here to the meeting. Now, I want to introduce you to a concept. It's called framing a conversation. The graphic has a frame and 3 words on it: introduction, body, and conclusion. Now, if you've taken any sort of public speaking class in the past, you probably learned the tell them strategy. The tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And that is an okay strategy for a speech. But if we can agree that a meeting is a 2-way dialogue, then we're doing more than telling. We're listening, we're connecting dots, we're facilitating the discussion. And so we need something better than a tell them strategy. And today I'm going to introduce you to the framing strategy. When we frame up conversations, we provide direction, purpose, context, and a reason for people to want to participate in the conversation. So here, I have what appears to be sticky notes laid out on the screen. In the upper left-hand corner, we have one called the audience's current situation. Let's say that I am your manager and I recognize that you are frustrated with some process that I've been forcing on the team. So as I'm thinking about the meeting that I'm going to have about fixing this process, I want to identify what's my audience, or what's this group of people thinking? Why are we in this room? Well, they're frustrated with the process. So the goal of this conversation would be to roll out the new process. Then going down to the lower left on the agenda, I might talk about 4 things. What's not working? We're going to fix the process using an app. I'm going to roll out some new features, and then we'll talk about next steps. And then the 4th piece of the frame would be letting people know why they should communicate, or why they should participate in the conversation by talking about the benefits. Less frustration, and they're going to have a quicker turnaround. So I've just done the brain work. I've done this analog with sticky notes. That gets me prepared to go into this conversation. So let me just model what framing can sound like. Well, hey everybody, I want to recognize that we have a really frustrating process, and the goal of today's conversation is I'm going to roll out a new one. And I'm going to talk about 4 things. So first I'm going to acknowledge what was not working with that old process. Then I'm going to talk about the app that we've purchased to make this new process better. We'll talk about some new features that we're rolling out, and then finally some next steps for implementation. When we're done here, there's going to be a lot less frustration in the room, and you'll see that we'll have a quicker turnaround on this process. So you can see that that was what, maybe 30, 35 seconds. And I was just in that short amount of time able to provide you with a sense of direction, purpose, context, and a reason to participate today. So that was a very generic example. Let me show you one that's maybe a little more closely related to the work that you do. Now, with the one caveat that I'm not nearly as sophisticated working with family firms as you are, so you'll have to bear with the simplicity of my example. So let's say that this is a client meeting, and we're in the process of developing the annual budget. So I might go into this conversation that I'm going to facilitate, saying something like this. Well, as we know, everybody, we've got the annual budgeting rolling around, and I want to recognize that we've had some changes in the family dynamics recently that may play a role in today's conversation. So our goal today is to understand the financials and the variables that we're looking at for the next 5 years. So we're going to review today's snapshot of where we are. Then we're going to review the succession plan because those family changes, we might want to take a look at that. And then finally, we'll talk about some growth projections into the next 5 years. When we are done today, we should have a really good handle on the 5-year plan. So there, again, maybe 40 seconds worth, but I was able to set the context, the direction, the purpose, and give everybody a reason to come into the meeting. Now, one of the things you might be thinking right now is, this is pretty basic. I probably already do this. And by the way, you're saying some things that seem fairly obvious. Yes, that's your job as the leader of the meeting, is to state the obvious and make sure that everybody is on the same page. You don't want any ambiguity there. All right, if you are interested, here's a free download. We've got this framing strategy worksheet. It takes those 4 stickies and really blows it out into a full process. So it helps you go analog. It can help you get your head in the game, especially for those high stakes conversations that you're having. This tool will help you organize your thoughts, set context, and coach your team. And you can see that there is a URL there. It's learn.turpincommunication.com/frame. And bear with me for just a moment. I am going to drop that into the chat box for you. There, you'll have access to that link. And as Bridget said earlier, I did send her a copy of this deck, and so this slide with the URL will be there if you're so inclined. Okay, going back to our ground rules for effective meetings and working our way down, we want to make sure that we are keeping the conversation fruitful, which means as the facilitator, you're delivering information clearly and concisely, and you're keeping everything focused and fruitful. On the other side, for the participants, they're going to participate if we make it easy for them to do so. So that means that they need to listen and be fully present, as I've already stated. Now, here's another graphic. This guy, depending on where you are from in the world, this might be a teeter-totter or a seesaw or any number of other words that we've used to describe this playground thing. But I'm going to call it a teeter-totter. And this guy is balancing both control of the meeting, control of the message, but he's also encouraging people to participate. Now, this graphic is a little bit deceiving because it's not as if the teeter-totter should always be level. There are times when you need to exert pressure on one side or the other. In other words, I need to take more control of this meeting, or I need to let go of control and encourage more people to participate. So here I have the dangers of, if you exert too much control, you might stifle discussions. You might interrupt people, skim the surface, or ignore individuals' needs. Now, I said earlier that my hunch is that everybody on this call is a very good communicator, clear communicator. I would encourage you to think about these concepts as they apply to the other people that you work with and your team members. So if you find that you or some of your team members are exerting too much control over meetings, here are some ideas. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but they will be in the deck if you choose to download that a little bit later. But you want to make sure that you're keeping everyone in mind. Allow yourself to probe and discuss, engage individuals. You might black out the slide. If you're using a slide deck, just hitting the letter B, which I'm going to do right now, will take the screen to black. And what that does is it says the conversation that was taking place earlier, not important. Let's remove that distraction, and now let's talk about whatever it was that someone brought up. So blacking out the screen is actually a really effective technique. Moving down this list, dig deeper, ask open-ended questions, go where they lead, and discuss the emotions. So those are all techniques that you can use to encourage and draw people out more in meetings if you find that you are exerting too much control. On the other hand, we might encourage too much. And actually what we've learned working with consultants over the years is because we understand the benefit in getting people talking, that we might encourage too much, which means we might let discussions go too long, we might get off track, run out of time, and get derailed. So here are some ideas for exerting more control. And again, you're more than welcome to use these techniques with other members of your team. So keep the goal in mind, refer to the agenda, work to be concise, engage the group, ask closed questions, whereas we were asking open-ended questions on the other side, using a parking lot. And a parking lot is just a whiteboard or even a piece of paper where you jot down something. So it's as if you're saying, that's a really important point. I'm going to write that down. I'm going to document it, and we're going to deal with it later. Other ways of describing that are, let's take that offline. Other techniques for exerting control would be summarizing, going on, and acknowledging emotions. And I'm going to stop right here because oftentimes people have questions about this whole concept of encourage and control. So I'll just open it up here. Are there any questions about this particular concept? Okay, I'm not seeing that there's any chat here, but Bridget, if somebody does happen to chat after I move on, feel free to interrupt me.
Yeah, I do have one. It says, any recommendations for dealing with emotional or hostile situations?
Oh boy, emotional and hostile, yeah. So let's talk about the bottom element on these two slides. So let me go up here to this one. So we can see that on the encourage side, is about discussing emotions. Discussing emotions is saying, I hear you, you're upset, tell me more. Can you tell me what's underlying the frustration? Anybody else feeling frustrated? So what you're doing is you're allowing that frustration to come out. Because if you think about it, if there's frustration or hostility or emotion that's in the room, the meeting is not going to be as fruitful as you need it to be unless that issue is dealt with. Now, that said, there are times when discussing the emotions just isn't appropriate. So on the control side, it's about acknowledging emotions. So saying things like, I hear you, you're frustrated, we'll deal with that later, but our goal today is X, Y, and Z, so let's move on if we can. Now, that technique is going to be situational. If you've got a client who is experiencing a lot of emotion, asking them to put that aside is maybe not appropriate. You may have to meet it head on, which is about what I talked about earlier, which was discussing the emotions. Thanks, Bridget, for that question. Okay, getting back to our ground rules here, let's move into listening. So on the left-hand side, the facilitator needs to say things, or needs to think things like, I value everyone's input, I'm going to work to understand your perspective. And then, as participants, when we speak, we want to feel that we're being heard and that our input is welcome and valued, right? And now what this means then is both parties have to be fierce listeners. They need to work to connect dots and build off of what's come before. All right, our final piece here at the bottom of the handout is all about the follow-up. And I think that a lot of times meetings just sort of fizzle out and we leave meetings going, I'm not sure what we decided, I'm not sure what our next steps are. So you don't want to do that with your meetings. So as a facilitator, you want to make sure that you're summarizing and setting next steps and then following up with whatever those next steps are. As meeting participants, we need to agree to next steps and then deliver on our promises, whatever those are. So if we take a look at this entire handout, we actually used to call it a contract because we felt like, let's just get everybody to agree that this is how we are going to conduct ourselves in meetings. You can refer to it as a contract if you want. You can print this thing out and put it on your boardroom wall, frame it, whatever. I know a lot of clients actually do frame this and put it in their conference rooms. So I hope that walking through this infographic, I guess you could call it, was helpful. I'll just open it up now to the group. What is this missing? What would you add if you were going to add more ground rules for meetings? And this could be internal meetings with your firm, or it could be external meetings with clients. So I will just let that question sit for a couple moments and see if anybody adds. You can type something into the chat box. Confidentiality. Thank you, Teresa. Yes. Confidentiality absolutely is important in certain circumstances. Participants should agree to respect differing opinions. Yep, we can agree to be not disagreeable. Someone's asking, do you have guidelines for attendee to attendee interactions? Oh, okay. So what you're saying is that two attendees are maybe having a sidebar conversation. And those things do happen for sure. And a lot of times those sidebar conversations are good. They allow a new thought to enter. So when those sidebars happen, I think as facilitator, it's perfectly reasonable to acknowledge that it's happening and let that conversation take its natural course and ask them if they would like to share back into the meeting. And all the while, of course, being respectful. Now, there are times when you're in an internal meeting where you might be a little more heavy-handed by asking people to, take that conversation after the meeting is over. So it's really going to be situational. Someone just says it's kind of rules of engagement for the participants. Yep, exactly. For example, if two siblings are on opposing sides of an issue. Yep. Okay, good conversation, everybody. Thanks so much for chiming in there. And we're going to move on. I mentioned earlier that I have some bonus material because I knew it wouldn't take a full hour to work through that infographic. So what I have done here is I have organized some content that we often get asked about. And the content, a lot of this applies to presentations and meetings and a little bit to training sessions. So I've got six categories here, I guess. One would be about engagement and dealing with nervousness. So if you are on the line and you experience nervousness, you might want to vote for that one. Well, also, the second one at the top here is about strengths and weaknesses. So I had talked earlier about this notion of an orderly conversation, and what we've discovered is that people are stronger on either the organization side or the conversational side, and that brings strengths and weaknesses. So I'm happy to talk about that if you're interested in that. If you or team members tend to be long-winded, we can talk about how to get to the point when you are someone who talks a lot. Moving down to the lower left-hand side, I can talk about best practices for designing and delivering visual aids. As the middle bottom one states, I can talk about storytelling for business and how a tool to help you craft and tell stories that get results. And then the third category there on the lower right would just be to open it up for a Q&A. So I'll let you vote in the chat, and the category that gets the most votes will just go in that direction. I'm seeing a couple of engagements, one on visual aids. Dealing with nerves. Oh, we're going to get a vote for everything here, aren't we? I've got one for storytelling. Okay, well, engagement and nervousness seems to be the hottest one, and this will only take me a couple of minutes, so we'll come back to this menu and maybe pick something else. So let's talk about engagement and dealing with nerves. So as the image here shows, this guy is engaged. The arrows are pointing out, and he's connecting with his audience. Now, when someone is engaged, as the bottom of the screen shows, you're able to think on your feet. And we had talked about that sense of encouraging and controlling. It's only when you are fully engaged and fully present that you're able to make really solid decisions on how are you going to move forward. In other words, thinking on your feet. So that's the level of engagement that we want to get to all the time. So when you are engaged, as the left-hand side of the screen is showing, our focus is outward. We are in this moment right here. We're not thinking forward and not thinking backward. We see faces, we respond, we're self-aware, we're in control, we're connected, we're feeling comfortable, and we can rely on our instincts. We all know what it feels like to be engaged because you're engaged most of the time when you are in low-stakes one-on-one conversations. The tricky part is when you are preparing for a high-stakes meeting or presentation and the nervousness starts to kick in. So this next slide is going to show us what it can feel like when we're disengaged or we're nervous. In other words, we're in our head. We might experience greater nervousness. We have an internal focus rather than an external focus. We might worry about being perfect or having a performance. You might think about your voice, your hands, your body. You've probably all been in the situation where all of a sudden your hands felt really weird. They felt heavy and you didn't know what to do with them. That's because you're not engaged. Because when you are engaged, your hands automatically know what to do. Working our way down that list of items there, when you're not engaged, you might focus on the information rather than the explanation. And you might miss cues from other people. So that's what we want to avoid. Here are two skills that help us get there. Now, I want to talk about what exactly is a skill. A skill is a behavior that you already know how to do, but it's intentionally applied. So as the screen shows, pausing and breathing, eye contact, these are behaviors that you do automatically. But when you are feeling nervous, you have to use these skills intentionally. So just taking a step back, pausing, breathing, that can settle your mind so that you're more likely to feel comfortable moving forward. And then eye contact allows you to make a connection with listeners. You've probably all been in this situation where you've walked out of a high-stakes situation and as you think back on it, you might be thinking, I don't remember what I said, or I don't remember who I said it to. That's an indication that you were not fully engaged. So that means that being intentional with eye contact is really critical. Now, the situation that we're in right now, I cannot make eye contact with you. I mean, I'm making eye contact with a camera that's about 2 feet away from me, but that's not true engagement. So when you're in a live room with people, you want to make sure that you're really focusing on them so that you can read their responses and zigzag and then take the conversation accordingly. So the question that was well, the comment that was made earlier was about you wanted to focus on nervousness and engagement. These two things are very closely intertwined. You can't be engaged, or you can't work through nervousness without being fully engaged and in the moment. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. And as the bottom of my screen shows right now, these two skills, it's not about the appearance of delivery skills, it's about the effect that they have on you. So you may have heard in the past, well, people are going to make you nervous, so look over their heads. That's bad advice, because looking over their heads keeps you disengaged. It's not until you actually make that connection and feel what that is like that you can then move forward in a comfortable way. And then that also means when you're pausing, going back to our guy on the teeter totter, you're able to make really strong decisions and use skills and behaviors and techniques that are a decision rather than just a knee-jerk reaction. Okay, here we are back with our menu. I want to take a look at the chat again. Did any of the other things, storytelling seemed to bubble up. Great, let's talk about storytelling.
Greg,
we've got it.
Greg,
oh,
let me just ask you something, because a lot of, before we move on to storytelling, because we definitely have time to do both. So a lot of participants on the call, they also do meetings with clients via web like this. So what are some ways, considering that sort of use case, what are some things that we can do in this environment?
Sure. Well, I'm doing my best to model effective webinar behaviors right now. And I have to tell you, doing webinars, although I'm very happy to have been invited to lead today's session, I kind of don't like doing it. I'll be very honest. I really crave the connection that I have with people when I am in a room with them. And right now I am sitting in the solitude of my office here in Chicago, and I'm trying to engage, as I said, this camera. But that's exactly what we need to do. So oftentimes what I see is that people tend to focus on the thumbnails of the videos. So I'm looking right now at Andrea or Andrea, I'm not sure how you pronounce your name, but anyway, I'm looking at that video of you. But if it looks to you like I'm completely disengaged. So while I want to look at the people that are on the screen, because I want to see how are they receiving the information, my job is to engage the camera. And it's so hard to remember to do. And I'm sure that you've noticed that I, from time to time, look down at my laptop to look at the slides that I have in front of me. And it's not that you shouldn't do that. You definitely want to look at the slides, but you want to make sure that it's more of a glance than it is focusing on the slides, because you know the listeners are right up there. And I might also note that I am not using the webcam that is part of my computer. I'm using a high definition camera that is on a tripod on the opposite side of my laptop. The reason I do that is because the video camera in our laptops would be too low, and they would be shooting up my nose, and trust me, nobody looks good when the camera is shooting up the nose. So I always encourage people to get another camera and set it up a little bit higher. Does that cover everything, Bridget, that you'd like me to talk about in terms of virtual?
Yep.
Great. Well, let's take the last 10 minutes and dive into storytelling. All right. So I think we probably can all agree that there's a high degree of power that comes from telling stories. I've told a few stories already in today's webinar. Stories make content come to life. It helps people visualize, and it also helps people understand what the future might look like if you are trying to get somebody to, trying to persuade them to a future state. So there's no doubt about it, storytelling is really, really helpful. But a lot of people think, I'm no good at it. And I would say, I bet you're better at it than you think, because we all tell stories about the guy on his phone in the traffic that caused an accident or was about to cause an accident. We tell stories about our vacations. We tell stories about imagining what it's going to be like once we get to the amusement park or the big game, right? We tell stories all the time. The difference is that when you're telling stories for a business purpose, they need to be told intentionally. So here we have the definition of storytelling for business. This is our definition. So stories describe events that happened or could happen at another time in another place. And business stories are always part of a larger conversation and are told with specific intent. Let's talk about the bottom piece of that. What that means is that you're not going into a meeting to tell a story. You're going into a meeting with a goal in mind that you might be able to access this story to help you reach the goal, right? So the goal isn't the telling of the story. The goal is to do the thing, get people to buy, agree, align, learn, and using the story as a tool. Now, a lot of storytelling books and other resources that are out there suggest that you have to have a hero and a villain and a climax and a denouement and all of this stuff. And we would say, don't complicate it. Let's simplify this thing. Let's figure out a way that you can tell, building upon your own strengths already as a storyteller, build on those strengths to make them business worthy. So we're going to simplify and say there are three basic story types for business. Anecdotes, this is where you just simply share an experience. I shared an experience with you about Sue, the leader of that big meeting. It might be an analogy where you make a comparison. This thing happened and it's a lot like what's happening right here. So let's learn from it. And then of course, hypotheticals. This is where you're painting the picture of what the future might look like, or the peril of what the future might look like. So let me give you another example of an anecdote. So this experience took place in Chicago at Northwestern University. Northwestern University is one of our primary clients, and we were working with a group of trainers. And one of these trainers, her name is Cindy, and Cindy is one of these powerhouse sorts of people, right? She walks into a room and the room lights up. People notice. She has an enormous head of bright red hair. So you can just sort of imagine the power that Cindy has. And Cindy in this training session was working on delivering some pretty dull training. It was about change management, and she was delivering this training to a group of senior leaders at the university. And she was practicing this training, and it was just dull as dirt. I mean, it was just plain boring. And she knew that. But anyway, we captured that on video, and then she and I went into a private room to watch her video, and my intention was to coach her to make this thing more exciting. So we're watching her video, and I can tell that she's pretty upset with the way she's coming across. And I knew in that moment what we needed to do. So I stopped the video from playing and I turned to her. I said, Cindy, I think you're missing an opportunity here to tell a story. Why don't you paint a picture of what change management could actually look like? And she says, nah, I'm terrible at telling stories. I've read the books. I took the classes. I even hired a consultant friend of mine to help me craft a story. And I told a story, or at least I tried to tell a story, and in this one training session, and it just fell flat, and I was embarrassed, and I got all the details tangled up, and I said, Cindy, wait a minute. You're telling me a story. Don't tell me you can't tell stories. And she sort of stepped back, and she was amazed that she actually had the skills to do that. Okay, so I just told you that story, and the reason I wanted to tell you that story is because I really want to make the point that we're all storytellers. We all do it all the time. We just need tools to help us do it. So now I'd like to introduce you to a tool. So when you're thinking about telling a story, you want to identify the goal. What are you trying to accomplish? So in the story that I just told you, my goal was to convince you that you're already a good storyteller. So using this tool, I might write that out. And then there are the raw elements, or the raw material of the story. These are the who, the what, who, where, whens, and whys of the story. So when you're crafting the story, you can just identify what is the event that I'm going to talk about, and then fill out the rest of the W's there. And then the W's aren't enough, though. That's like the raw material of the story, or the scaffolding, but you need to flesh it out. So that means then in the telling of the story, you can emphasize or de-emphasize emotions, senses, and details. You might also add dialogue. And if this is a formal presentation, there might also be a visual that you use to tell the story. Now, let me deconstruct for you the story that I just told you about Cindy. So if we look at the raw material here in the left-hand side, the what is we were in a workshop and I was coaching her. The who's involved were Cindy, Greg. I realize I didn't mention Dale, but he was another instructor that was in the room. And Cindy also mentioned the consultant friend that she had worked with. Where were we? We were at Northwestern University in Chicago. It happened a few months ago. And the reason this story took place is because I recognized that Cindy had missed an opportunity. Now, moving over to the right-hand side, in the emotions bucket, we can see that she was feeling some frustration. She got very animated when she was telling the story, and she felt stupid. So those are all the emotions. The senses, okay, she had red hair, her speaking pace picked up, her volume picked up as I projected to you as I was telling the story. The details would be her presence. As my slide shows, sometimes I name her Carol and sometimes I name her Cindy. I don't know why I do that, but I meant to call her Carol at this time. And also there was a dull class. So you can see that as I'm mapping out these stories, I can then emphasize or de-emphasize those elements. And I tell this story a lot. And one time I left out the element of her red hair. The story fell flat. And so I know that when I talk about Cindy or Carol, whatever I choose to name her that day, that the image that I give you by talking about this enormous red hair, this lovely head of hair that she has, that puts that picture in your head. Okay. I've added a couple of things here to the storytelling tool, which is on the far left side, there's the lead in. As I said earlier, a story doesn't live on its own, right? It's part of a larger conversation. So you always want to have some sort of a lead in. And then on the other side of the screen, you want to make sure that you bring the story home. In other words, you are making a connection to the goal that you had set out when you crafted the story. All right. That brings us to the end of today's conversation. I want to thank you very much. Bridget, were there any other questions that bubbled up as we were talking? I am looking at this and yeah, it doesn't look like there were any other questions that bubbled up. So I want to thank you all very much. If you want to get in contact with me, you can see that my email address is greg@turpincommunication.com. And there's my LinkedIn profile. Happy to link up with you if you are so inclined. So with that, Bridget, I'm going to turn things back over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for spending some time with us today. I hope this was helpful. It was kind of the tip of the iceberg and everything that Greg does. So thank you so much for that. And I will we'll send everyone the video recording of this, as well as the presentation that Greg has shared with us as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Bridget.
All right. Thanks,
and thanks everybody for joining us.